Some disappearances are not escapes. They are exchanges, paid in silence and sealed by honour. It begins on a winter morning at Paddington Station, where a wooden bench remembers more than it was ever meant to witness, and a man vanishes into the mist without a name. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The fog is thick, the truth elusive, and the journey, it seems, does not always end in arrival. Let us walk the platform one final time. It was one of those bleak and dripping evenings in late October, when the air in London takes on the smell of rusted iron and wet coal dust. The gas lamps along Paddington Station glowed dimly through the curtain of rain, their lights smeared by the mist that rose off the sodden platforms. A porter moved in silence past a wooden bench on platform 9, on which sat a solitary leather briefcase, untouched, unclaimed, and glistening with droplets. There was nothing outwardly remarkable in the sight, and yet something in its stillness, in the way the world seemed to pass it by without notice, planted in me the first seed of unease. Months later, I still recall that image. A bench, a briefcase, and a quiet that clung too tightly to it all. It was on the same evening, not long after I'd returned to Baker Street from a tiresome dinner engagement, that Holmes received a most unexpected caller. The hour was late, and the knock upon the door sharp and economical, neither hesitant nor hurried, but imbued with the confidence of one used to having doors opened without delay. Mrs. Hudson, with a discreet glance in my direction, ushered in a tall, spare gentleman of perhaps 60 years, dressed in a dark Inverness and bearing the haggard expression of a man not accustomed to asking for help. He introduced himself as Sir Reginald Colmore of the Foreign Office. Holmes, who had been leafing through a monograph on Persian poisons, set it aside at once. To visit me at this hour, Sir Reginald, suggests either great urgency or great discretion. Which shall I assume? Both, came the reply. I apologise for the intrusion, Mr. Holmes, but the matter cannot afford delay, nor, if I may be candid, the exposure of regular channels. A man in the diplomatic registry has disappeared under circumstances we find troubling. Holmes inclined his head. And Scotland Yard has not yet been informed. Sir Reginald hesitated. Nor will they be, unless the need becomes unavoidable. The name of the missing man, as Sir Reginald then disclosed, was Percy Henshaw, a mid-tier clerk with a respectable if unremarkable tenure in the Eastern Affairs Bureau. He was known neither for brilliance nor scandal, and had long been trusted with the sort of documentation whose importance lies precisely in its invisibility. He boarded the 8:19 from Paddington, Sir Reginald said, bound for Reading. His purpose for travel was routine, a delivery of coded transcripts to a secure contact. He was seen entering his compartment shortly before departure, and yet he drew in a breath. By the time the train reached its first scheduled stop, Mr. Henshaw was no longer aboard. No staff member observed his disembarkation. The compartment was empty, and most curious of all, his briefcase was left behind, precisely where he had been seen placing it. Holmes steepled his fingers. A man entrusted with secure diplomatic communications does not forget his briefcase, Sir Reginald. He leaves it only if he means to deceive. There is a particular chill that arises not from weather but from logic, when all observable facts appear to cohere, and yet the outcome remains absurd. As Holmes and Sir Reginald spoke, I found myself fixated on the impossible question. How could a man vanish from a sealed train, in view of dozens of passengers and station staff, without so much as a murmur of alarm? There were no reports of commotion, no doors found ajar, no signalman with an unusual sighting, and yet the man was gone, as if spirited out into the mist between two stations. I had seen many disappearances under Holmes's tutelage, but few that began with such a perfect absence of disturbance. Either, Holmes said quietly, Mr. Henshaw left the train unseen, or he was never aboard at all. We arrived at Paddington just past the noon hour the following day, the skies no clearer, the station crowded with a rush of umbrellas and trailing luggage. Sir Reginald, citing the sensitivity of his office, had excused himself from joining us. At platform 9, we were met by a porter, a lank fellow with a habit of wiping his hands on his waistcoat, whether they were dirty or not. He gestured toward a wooden bench near the eastern signal post. There, beneath the cast of a flickering gas lamp, sat the briefcase. It was an ordinary object to the eye, brown calfskin, brass corners, and a well-worn handle polished by use. Yet it had been there for nearly 18 hours, unclaimed and, save for the occasional passing glance, unnoticed. In that detail alone lay something peculiarly unsettling, as though the bench itself had grown used to its company. Holmes crouched beside the bench, his fingertips brushing the outer seam of the case as though reading a page. He sniffed lightly at the handle, then held up one palm to halt the porter, who had taken a step forward. Damp on the underside, Holmes observed. It was placed here in rain, not simply caught in it. No effort to conceal, no effort to protect. He took a small implement from his coat, one of his many unassuming tools, and pressed it gently into the case's lock. It opened with a soft, metallic click. "No force marks," he murmured. Either he left it willingly, or someone with his confidence did. I said nothing, but leaned slightly closer, peering over his shoulder. The scent that escaped was one of paper, old ink, and leather softened by years of handling. Inside the briefcase, the contents appeared to be in order, sheaves of official papers, each bound by a ribbon and sealed with the discreet markings of the Foreign Office. Holmes lifted them gently, one by one, his gaze sharpening as he aligned their sequence. Then he stopped. He tapped twice upon the inner flap. "Observe, Watson." Between the folders was a narrow gap, not wide enough to hold a full sheaf, but just enough to suggest displacement. Holmes slid his finger along the linen lining and extracted a stiff paper backing, an index sheet. He held it aloft. "The final item on this list," he said softly, "is not present." I leaned closer to read it. Dispatch 7C. Summary of encoded field reports. Vienna Station. "And now," Holmes said, returning the index to the briefcase with surgical precision, "the game begins." The next morning found us once more at Paddington Station, the day grey with an unyielding drizzle and the ironwork of the roof ringing faintly with the patter of mist-laden drops. The great platform clock above platform 9 showed 10:15. There was little bustle at that hour, only the steady trundle of luggage carts and the voices of clerks echoing from the booking hall. Holmes moved with a peculiar deliberation, his eyes sweeping across the girders, the placement of the benches, the intervals between the gas lamps. He marked the distance between the waiting compartments and the station's nearest egress, then studied the fading chalk markings that outlined where the 8:19 train had stood the night before. His silence was complete, save for a single murmur as he pointed to a broken sliver of matchstick near the rear buffer post. Not struck, but broken. Curious. There was an unrehearsed ritual to these early examinations, Holmes moving with the quiet intensity of a naturalist studying the print of an animal that had passed unseen in the night. At Holmes's quiet instruction, a porter was summoned, a man of 50 years with thinning hair, a narrow face, and sleeves discoloured by years of handling coal-slaked trunks. He seemed unbothered by the importance of the questions put to him, but answered without guile. "Yes, sir, I helped the gentleman aboard, Mr. Henshaw, I think it were." Gave him a nod when he showed his travel chit, and he climbed into the third-class carriage, compartment number 4, I believe. That would be just near the signal box end, it would. And he had his briefcase at the time? Oh yes, brown, well-handled. He set it down on the bench before climbing aboard, then took it with him when the whistle blew. Holmes looked the man over for a moment. "You saw him enter the carriage, but did you observe him depart?" The porter frowned. "No, sir, but I would have noticed had he come back through." "He didn't." It was only after a moment's silence, during which Holmes inspected the porter's shoes as though they were maps, that the man added, "There was someone else, now that I think of it." "Go on," Holmes said gently. "A ragged sort of fellow, bit too well spoken for a tramp but too rumpled for a clerk. Had an umbrella, large thing, patched, like it'd been repaired in 5 different colours. He weren't travelling. Stood there near compartment 5, never got on, just loitered." Holmes's brow rose slightly. "How long was he present?" "Oh, a few minutes. Watched the passengers mostly, not in any hurry. I don't think he even looked at the train once it began to move." Holmes offered a dry smile. "Men who do not look at trains as they depart are either philosophers or liars." From the platform, we were shown to a dim office behind a weather-scarred door marked Duty Supervisor. There we met the station master, a man of solid girth and remarkable cynicism, who received Holmes with the resigned air of one accustomed to amateur investigators. "Foreign office business, is it?" he asked, stirring his tea without looking up. "Not the first briefcase to vanish from this station, I'll wager." Holmes said nothing of import for several minutes, merely letting the man speak, which he did freely, sprinkling his account with grumbling allusions to budget cuts, lazy guards, and the public's tendency to forget umbrellas. At last, Holmes interrupted, not unkindly. "There is an inconsistency in your platform records. The train was due to leave precisely at 8:19 and did so, yes?" The station master hesitated. "Well, there was a pause, short one, not officially noted." Holmes's tone was mild. "A mechanical fault?" The man snorted. "No, sir. Signalman on gate 4 says it stopped for half a minute beyond the outer post. Claims the indicator flashed amber when it oughtn't to have." Holmes gave a soft, unreadable nod. We returned to the platform with our thoughts heavy and the sky no less grey than before. Holmes remained contemplative as he traced the route from the platform's end to the outer gate, his gaze lingering where the lamplight gave way to murk and rail. "A 30-second pause, Watson," he said quietly, "just beyond the reach of witness. No light, no porters, no sound but the engine's breath." "Long enough?" I asked. He glanced at me. "For a man prepared, more than sufficient. One does not require time, only opportunity." I followed his gaze, now turned toward a hedge that lined the outer fence. Its shape concealed a break in the ironwork, where a man might vanish into night without so much as a footstep to mark his passage. The question that had haunted me began to take shape. Had Henshaw intended to vanish? Or had someone else decided that he must? We were granted access to the very carriage in which Mr. Henshaw had last been seen. An older model, with sliding doors and worn leather upholstery. Holmes entered it like a man revisiting the scene of a ghost's passing. The compartment was clean, too clean. Holmes examined the seat cushions and gestured toward a faint crease. A dip too sharp for an undisturbed seat. He sniffed lightly. "Rainwater," he murmured. "Yet the windows are sealed." He knelt and ran his finger along the edge of the door. This was opened after the train departed, and closed again, from outside. "How could you know?" "Because the tread outside is damp," Holmes replied. "But the threshold inside has dried." There was no further comment. None was needed. As we stepped from the carriage and prepared to take our leave, a woman in the station's green apron passed us with a pail and rag in hand. She looked up briefly. "You're asking about the 8:19, are you?" "We are," Holmes said. "I see. Well, I was meant to clean its carriages after it returned, but it never stopped properly last night. Not for me to see the numbers anyhow. Rolled past too quickly." Holmes did not speak for a moment. Then he turned to me with a look I'd seen before, one that meant the map was drawing itself, line by line. "Come, Watson, the narrative grows clearer, but we are still without its moral." It was shortly after 2 o'clock the following afternoon when a knock at our Baker Street door stirred Holmes from the lean reverie in which he had sat for some time, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mrs. Hudson, with her usual composed discretion, ushered in a woman of modest bearing and careful composure. She was plainly dressed in a tweed travelling coat, slightly damp at the hem, and wore a modest hat with a grey velvet ribbon that had seen better seasons. Her hands were ungloved, and she clasped a small reticule that betrayed a tightness in the knuckles, the kind that accompanies a decision not lightly made. "Mr. Holmes?" she inquired, in a voice neither timid nor assertive. Holmes inclined his head. "At your service, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson." The woman offered a brief, almost apologetic nod. "My name is Miss Cora Beale. I believe I may possess information relevant to the gentleman who vanished from the reading train." We offered her a seat, and Holmes, without fuss, drew the heavy curtain slightly to mute the street sounds, a gesture that seemed to put her somewhat at ease. Her face was not one that attracted attention. Fair, thin, with a delicacy that suggested long exposure to restraint and duty. A governess by her own account, she explained that she had been travelling that evening in the same train as Mr. Percy Henshaw. "I was seated in the compartment opposite his," she said, "not directly adjacent, but with a clear view when the doors opened at stations. I recognised him from his description in the papers, though I did not know him by name at the time." Holmes nodded for her to continue. "He boarded alone. I noted that, for he took great care in arranging a satchel beside him. It looked heavy. During the journey, he rose and stepped briefly into the corridor. There, he appeared to speak with a woman who had joined from another compartment. It was her appearance that caught my attention," Miss Beale continued. "She was striking, not in beauty, but in attire. A dark fur-trimmed cloak, fashionable but heavy for the season, and gloves of a most vivid blue, almost theatrical." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "She spoke to Mr. Henshaw in the corridor?" he asked. "Yes, it was only a moment. They exchanged but a few words, and then he nodded and moved to the carriage behind mine. I did not see him again." Holmes did not speak at once, but tapped his fingers lightly against the arm of his chair. "And you saw her again?" Miss Beale hesitated. "No, sir. I looked for her at Reading Station, but she did not alight. Nor did he. That was when I realised something was amiss." Holmes turned his gaze toward the fire. "The woman, did she carry anything?" "A slim case, I believe. Black leather, worn." "And you are quite certain of the gloves?" "I could not forget them." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his tone still gentle but unmistakably pointed. "And in that corridor, what words were spoken?" Miss Beale answered too quickly. He said, "It won't come back to me, I promise you." There was a pause. "You heard that clearly?" Holmes asked. She froze. "Well, not clearly. I mean, I inferred." "But you quoted exactly, Miss Beale." Her mouth parted, then closed. A flush rose to her cheeks. "The corridor was draughty," Holmes continued. "The windows fogged. You told us you were seated in the next carriage, and yet you recall a sentence verbatim." Miss Beale clutched her reticule more tightly. "I may have misremembered," she murmured. Holmes nodded slowly, but said nothing. The silence pressed in. Sensing her discomfort, Holmes shifted his line of inquiry. "And what can you tell me of the train itself, Miss Beale? The layout?" She brightened slightly. "There were 6 compartments in our carriage, 3 on each side. Gaslights overhead, with brass fixtures." Holmes tilted his head. "Gaslight fixtures? In a third-class carriage?" She blinked. "Yes, I believe so." "I fear not. The 819's third-class compartments were lit by oil lamps mounted on the side panels." Miss Beale looked down. "And the woman in blue?" Holmes continued. "From which door did she emerge?" "From the second on the right." Holmes smiled faintly. "That would be the luggage compartment." Her knuckles had gone white upon her bag. "You have been most obliging," Holmes said quietly. "We thank you for your candour." She rose, her composure visibly fraying. "If there is anything more I can do—" "There is nothing more," Holmes replied. "You have already said too much." When the door had closed behind her, Holmes remained motionless for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the dying embers in the grate. Then he rose and took from his shelf a folder of railway timetables and passenger logs, thumbing through with practiced speed. "She is not listed," he said at last. "You suspected as much?" I asked. "From the moment she claimed to have overheard a conversation through a closed corridor door on a moving train. Her account was artfully constructed, just believable enough to gain our attention, but built on foundations that crumble under examination. She knew Henshaw." Holmes tapped the back of his hand against the arm of his chair. "Or someone who does. She volunteered information we had not requested, emphasized certain details that do not align with recorded facts. There is no passenger record for a Miss Beale on that route, and no woman of her description, with or without blue gloves, was observed by any porter." "Then she lied?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. She performed." Holmes stood by the window, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the worn rug. Outside, the sound of hooves and wheels passed distantly, muffled by the pain. "She was not on that train," he said softly. I waited, knowing better than to speak. "Her motive," he continued, "is not deceit for gain. It is either loyalty or fear. I cannot yet determine which." He turned from the window. "But we now know one thing with certainty. The false trail has begun, and where there is a decoy, there must also be something, or someone, worth concealing." And with that, the quiet once more descended upon our rooms, broken only by the soft creak of Holmes's chair as he resumed his seat. Fingers joined once again beneath his thoughtful eyes. The address we had obtained from Sir Reginald led us to a narrow street off the King's Road, where the Georgian facades wore their age with quiet dignity, and the clipped hedgerows stood like unspeaking sentinels. Number 43 was an unassuming lodging house, with ivy along its lower bricks and lace curtains yellowed by coal smoke. We were received by a housekeeper of uncertain years and failing patience, who seemed far more perturbed by the inconvenience of our visit than by the disappearance of her tenant. "Mr. Henshaw," she said, squinting. "Quiet man, paid regular, never left a scuff mark. Said he'd be gone one night, left Wednesday evening, and never came back." She offered us the key to his room with an air of reluctant surrender. "Didn't say where he was going, never did. I just know the rent's overdue by 2 days, and I don't care for ghosts with unpaid balances." Holmes accepted the key without comment, but I saw a flicker pass across his face. The faintest recognition that ghosts, indeed, had begun to populate this case. The room at the top of the stairs was spare but tidy, suffused with a cold that spoke of absence. It bore all the marks of a bachelor who neither expected nor welcomed company: a single reading chair by the window, a wash basin devoid of clutter, and shelves lined with modest volumes on military logistics and international tariffs. Yet there were small signs that something had disrupted this quiet order. A half-packed valise lay open at the foot of the bed, as if its contents had been selected in haste or indecision. A breakfast tray, untouched, stood on the writing desk beside a tepid carafe of coffee, and the ashtray, which might ordinarily have held the day's reflections in tobacco, was immaculately clean. Holmes moved slowly about the room, touching nothing, but noting everything. He paused by the open wardrobe. "He left his winter coat," he said absently, "and yet the forecast has promised frost." "What does it suggest?" I asked. "That he did not intend to be gone long, or that he knew he would not return?" It was I who stooped first toward the wastebasket, not from instinct but from habit, and found that its contents had not been emptied. Among the curled papers and spent matchsticks was a half-burnt photograph, its corners scorched and its image half consumed by flame. I passed it silently to Holmes. The photograph was of 2 men in uniform, standing stiffly before a stone balustrade. One I recognized at once as Henshaw, younger, moustached, but unmistakably him. The other had been more deliberately defaced. His face had been cut away with precision, and what remained of his figure was indistinct. though the posture was upright and the shoulders square. Holmes examined the edges with care, then turned it over. On the reverse, a faint line of ink had survived the burning. Altdorf, 1885. No signature, he murmured. But someone wished to erase this memory, not hastily, but thoroughly. He burned it, and yet he could not finish the job. I took the photograph again and studied what remained of the second figure. There was something rigid in the stance, something cultivated, even theatrical. The tunic bore the epaulets of an officer, though the insignia had faded with time, and the burn had obscured one sleeve. Then it struck me. The left hand was gloved, the right bare. An old military wound, perhaps, or a disguise for something else. "You know him?" I asked Holmes. He did not answer at once, but seated himself on the edge of the bed and regarded the image with distant eyes. "I believe," he said quietly, "that this man once stood trial for espionage. A court-martial held without civilian witness in the spring of '87. He vanished before sentence could be delivered and has not been seen in any official capacity since." I stared. "And Henshaw knew him?" "If he did not know him," Holmes replied, "then he feared him. And in matters of statecraft, fear is often the more enduring bond." The writing desk, though outwardly ordinary, bore one drawer whose lock resisted both key and coaxing. Holmes studied the grain, noted the stress around the edges, and withdrew a slender instrument from his inner pocket. A tool not unlike a dentist's pick. He inserted it beneath the lock with the delicacy of a surgeon, and within moments the mechanism clicked open. Inside lay only a single envelope, unmarked, save for a faint smudge along its seal. Holmes opened it and withdrew one sheet of typewritten paper. There was no date, no address, no signature. The message read, "If it reaches Whitehall, we are both ghosts." Nothing more. Holmes read it twice, then passed it to me. The simplicity of the phrase was its most chilling feature. It neither explained nor excused. It was not a threat, but a recognition. A grim acknowledgement between men who dealt in things never spoken aloud. We sat for a long moment without words. The street outside had gone quiet, as though even London had drawn breath to listen. Holmes folded the paper neatly and replaced it in the envelope. "I fear," he said, "we are not merely chasing a vanished clerk." As we descended the stairs, I felt a disquiet settle more firmly within me. I had witnessed many strange disappearances during my years at Holmes's side, but this one carried a different weight. It was not merely that a man had vanished without trace. It was that, behind his absence, there lingered the unmistakable odour of political decay. "If Henshaw was in communication with the man from the photograph," I said, "then this is not a matter for a private inquiry." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "But what agency would you trust with it?" I said nothing. "Precisely," he murmured. "There is no certainty now, only the shadows of duty, loyalty, and silence, all blurred, all dangerous." It was the first time I had seen Holmes not energized, but wearied, as though the truth had become not a prize, but a burden too complex for triumph. Back in our chambers, Holmes placed the torn photograph on the windowsill, letting the last grey light of day touch its damaged surface. He stood motionless for some time, one hand clasped behind his back, the other resting lightly on the curtain cord. "Note the angle," he said at last. I stepped forward. The photograph was cut, not torn, and burned only after the name beneath was removed. And yet the message in the drawer makes no reference to who it concerns. "You believe they are linked?" "I do," he said, "but not by sentiment, by secrecy." He turned to me then. "Watson, we are no longer dealing with a personal flight or a lover's deception. This is a calculus of silence. That photograph was a cipher, not a keepsake. And that letter," he stopped, "was not meant for discovery. It was meant to be read only in death. Not all letters," he added, almost to himself, are meant to be posted. Brixham Terrace, nestled just off Flood Walk in Chelsea, was one of those streets that seemed intentionally designed for anonymity. The houses were narrow and alike, their stone steps worn smooth by decades of quiet comings and quieter goings. Curtains were drawn not only against the morning glare, but against curiosity. No names adorned the gates. The iron knockers bore the patina of underuse. It was a place where one might live for years and never truly be known by one's neighbours, a feature, Holmes remarked with approval, that rendered it well suited to those who preferred their affairs to go unrecorded. We arrived beneath a sky of leaden grey, with a drizzle soft enough to deceive, but persistent enough to dampen the spirits. Holmes took his time walking the row, his gaze flitting from window to window, pausing at doors where the paint had chipped unevenly, or where boot scrapes suggested agitation rather than routine. "It is not the number of residents that concerns me," he said under his breath, "but the number of doors behind which they choose not to be seen." Number 17 caught Holmes's attention almost immediately. It was the only house on the terrace whose front window bore a green linen blind, not lowered fully, but just enough to obscure the interior while admitting a narrow shaft of light. The brass nameplate had been polished recently, though no name was inscribed upon it. We knocked, and after a minute's delay, a woman of angular frame and distrustful expression opened the door. Holmes's introduction was simple and disarming, framed in the language of inquiry regarding a friend whose lodging arrangements may have changed. The landlady's reply was a tight-lipped shrug. "Plenty of lodgers come and go. I don't trouble myself with the why of it. But some stay longer than others," Holmes said lightly, "and some keep habits that stray from the respectable norm." Her gaze flickered. "Number 17, she said after a pause, "lets its back room to a gentleman who pays well and prefers silence. He comes and goes at odd hours, receives visitors who never give names. I've asked no questions, and I'm owed no answers." Which, to Holmes, was the most telling answer of all. We took up watch from a tailor's shop opposite the house, its windows obscured by bolts of fabric. There, Holmes arranged himself by the side glass, his eyes never straying far from number 17's green-blinded window. It was just past 3 o'clock when a man emerged from the house's side door and descended the steps with a measured tread. He was dressed plainly, with a dark coat buttoned to the collar and a felt hat pulled low. Tinted spectacles obscured his eyes, and a neatly trimmed moustache masked the lower half of his face. But the gait, that was what Holmes had been waiting for. "He does not favour the left leg," he said softly, "but he turns it slightly outward when under pressure. Watch the rhythm of his steps. Deliberate, almost rehearsed. That, Watson, is not learned in a week. You believe it to be Henshaw? I believe the body remembers what the face may wish to forget." The man passed our vantage point without a glance, his movements carefully calculated to avoid haste. He carried no briefcase, no parcel, but his left coat pocket sagged perceptibly, a detail Holmes noted with quiet interest. "The spectacles are tinted too darkly for a man with natural sight," he murmured, "and the moustache sits ill on the jawline, a recent addition, trimmed in haste, not habit. Do you believe he suspects he is being followed? Not merely suspects, expects it. This is a man who moves through his world like one trespassing on borrowed time." Holmes's tone, while still measured, carried the faintest hint of gravity. "Let us see where the rabbit chooses to run." We trailed him with care, maintaining our distance through the winding lanes of Chelsea's quieter quarter. He paused once at a tobacconist's, pretending to peer at the window displays but never entering. Twice, he changed direction with no cause beyond instinct. "He avoids main roads," I whispered, "and mirrors." "Indeed," said Holmes. "He chooses routes of interruption, places where two alleys meet, where corners force one to pause, not the path of a man travelling, but of a man waiting for the sound of pursuit." I observed the man stop briefly at a street vendor's stall, speak a word or two, then move off again, always without looking behind. He is no stranger to surveillance, I noted. Nor to danger, Holmes added. But danger from whom, and for what cause? That is what we must soon press him to reveal. Our quarry returned to Brixham Terrace by a roundabout way, circling twice before slipping once more through the rear gate of number 17. Holmes did not follow. Instead, he turned to me. Speak with the landlady again. Ask about heating repairs. Mention a fictitious cousin in Whitechapel who resembles our subject. I require 5 minutes undisturbed. May I ask? You may, he said with a faint smile, but the answer would only bore you. I complied without delay, returning to the front door and engaging the landlady in a rambling inquiry designed to buy time. Meanwhile, Holmes made his way around the terrace's rear, and I saw him vanish into the alley that ran behind the houses, the very path I suspected, through which his secrets came and went at number 17. It was 20 minutes later when we reconvened in a quiet alcove. Holmes's expression was unreadable. I have spoken with him, he said. And? He lied. Holmes' account of the encounter was spare in detail but rich in implication. He had intercepted the man at the threshold of the garden door, presenting himself as an agent inquiring after a mutual acquaintance, Percy Henshaw. The man had stiffened. I do not know the name, he said, his tone deliberately neutral. Holmes had remarked gently that a man whose photograph had been found in Henshaw's lodgings might wish to reconsider his denials. I am not the man in your photograph. No, Holmes replied. You are a version of him. There had been a silence during which the man's fingers twitched toward his pocket, then retreated. I suggest, Holmes had said, you remain where you are for the moment. No good will come of flight. To this, the man had offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. There are things, he said, that cannot be explained without consequence. And then he turned away. It was not Holmes's habit to provoke unnecessarily, but as the man reached the threshold, he added one final, innocuous remark. A pity you missed the 8:19. You might have avoided the need for all this theatre. The man stopped. I left no evidence. Holmes said nothing. Then came the slip. Mr. Holmes, the man said without looking back, you pursue shadows where there are only choices. Holmes's face, I am told, revealed very little, but I know him well enough to have seen the flicker in his eyes. That momentary tightening of focus that always precedes some internal decision. He stepped back, allowing the man to pass without further word. As we watched him disappear once more behind the green blind of number 17, Holmes exhaled slowly. That, he said quietly, is unfortunate, and I knew at once that the game had shifted, not ended. There is a silence peculiar to certain buildings in Whitehall, not the hush of reverence, nor the stillness of abandonment, but a calculated quiet, cultivated by years of discretion and necessity. The Foreign Office possessed such silence in abundance. Our footsteps fell muted upon the thick carpets as we were conducted, without announcement, through a narrow interior corridor where no portraits hung and no windows admitted light. Holmes, as ever, was unaffected by the hush, though I confess that I found it unsettling. The air was dry, the walls colourless, and even the muffled echo of a doors closing behind us carried the weight of decisions not recorded in any archive. At the end of the corridor stood a door without inscription. Our escort, a silent man in civilian dress, opened it, bowed slightly, and departed, his absence as deliberate as his presence had been perfunctory. Within, Sir Reginald Colmore awaited us. The room was sparse, a single window veiled with gauze, a long walnut table, and 3 chairs, 2 of them unoccupied. Sir Reginald sat not at the head, but at the centre of the table's long side, his fingers laced before him, and his gaze directed at nothing in particular. There was no file before him, no inkstand or blotter, only a closed envelope and a cup of tea gone cold. He rose as we entered, nodding to Holmes and then to me. His face bore the pallor of a man who has read too many reports and slept too little. Holmes offered no greeting, but placed the briefcase gently upon the table and unlatched it. With quiet precision, he withdrew the contents and laid them before Sir Reginald in neat rows. "These," he said, "are your papers, though I suspect you know already what is and is not among them." Sir Reginald's lips tightened. He did not immediately reply. Holmes stepped back from the table and folded his arms behind him. "They are forgeries, of course, not crude, but unmistakable to the trained eye. Paragraphs lifted from older communiques. Signatures penned in the wrong hand. Elegant, but lacking the habits of pressure and spacing. Even the seals were wrong, not misapplied, merely too perfect." Sir Reginald regarded the array without moving. "They were never meant to deceive the recipient." "Precisely," Holmes said. "They were meant to be stolen, and they were." The admission hung in the room like fog suspended in a glass. There was no surprise in Sir Reginald's expression, only a kind of resignation. "Then you understand," he murmured, "why the Yard was never summoned." "I understand," Holmes replied, "that someone went to great lengths to stage a theft that would confirm suspicion without exposing the substance of the truth. That is not the same as understanding the truth itself." Sir Reginald leaned forward, his voice no longer evasive but hollowed. "We have reason to believe that the actual intelligence, the material referred to in the index, was never on paper. Henshaw had access to it, memorized it, and was meant to carry it discreetly to a contact in Berkshire. The briefcase was a theatre, a distraction. It allowed him to disappear without raising questions until he failed to appear at his destination." Holmes nodded slowly. "So the danger lies not in what was lost, but in what remains unaccounted for, in a man's mind, somewhere beyond our reach." "That is the essence of it," Sir Reginald said. "Then the question becomes," Holmes said softly, "whether he vanished because he was compromised or because he was loyal." Sir Reginald did not answer. After a long pause, Holmes stepped to the window and examined the gauze-covered glass, as though the outside light might offer a moral clarity the room lacked. "You suspected him," he said. It was not a question, but a statement. Sir Reginald's hands tensed around the edge of the table. "Yes, quietly, informally. There had been correspondence, traces of contact with a certain Viennese intermediary, the same man whose photograph was found in Henshaw's lodgings," I asked. Sir Reginald turned to me. "You found the photograph?" "We did," Holmes said. "And the accompanying note, which you will not find in your file." Sir Reginald exhaled, not with relief but something closer to grief. "That name," he said, "has never been spoken in this office. Yet it has been remembered," Holmes replied. It was Sir Reginald who finally broke the silence. "We could not move too early. Henshaw was still effective. He moved in circles we could not easily penetrate. Had we exposed him prematurely, we risked more than a man's career. We risked diplomatic fractures that might have widened into something far worse." "So you waited," Holmes said. "You watched." "We documented," Sir Reginald replied. "We tested. And when it became clear that he had memorized the intelligence and intended to travel alone, we arranged for the briefcase to be observed. Not intercepted. No, not until he failed to arrive." Holmes's gaze was cool. "So long as he was useful, he was permitted to wander the edge of treason." Sir Reginald's face remained composed. "We hoped he would return on the right side of it." Holmes turned back toward the table, his voice lowered to a hush that seemed to absorb rather than disturb the silence. "And if he chose to disappear?" he asked. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Sir Reginald did not look up, nor did he move. Holmes inclined his head slightly, then turned to me. "We have what we came for, Watson." And with that, the conversation, and whatever truth it might have offered, was closed. It was scarcely light when Holmes suggested we revisit Platform 9. The morning fog lay thick upon the rails, as though reluctant to yield what secrets it still held from us. Lamps flickered like watchful eyes in the grey, and the scent of damp steel and cinders hung heavily in the air. Holmes walked the length of the departure track in measured silence, his gaze lowered but not idle. Now and then he paused to observe a scratch on the buffer post or a discarded match head lodged between the stones. He was not looking for fresh footprints. He was tracing intentions long since departed. Few men would have seen anything in that empty platform but soot and puddles. But I had learned, by long association, that the ghosts Holmes sought left no shadows, only sequences, only pattern. And this morning, I could see he was assembling the final image. "It began here," he said softly, "and it ended before it began." As we stood near the end of the platform, Holmes's voice took on the clarity he reserved for retrospection. "Two men boarded the 819 that night," he said. "Both entered the same compartment, one just ahead of the other. The first carried a briefcase, the second carried only purpose." I looked at him, puzzled. The passengers recalled only one because they were meant to. Henshaw made certain of it. He positioned himself so as to be seen at the bench, at the door, with his case, and then, just before departure, he disappeared from public view. "And the other?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The other remained, quietly, in his place." The logic, once uttered, seemed suddenly self-evident, as though we had all along been reading the wrong half of the page. "It was a simple exchange," Holmes continued, "conducted in the corridor between compartments in the 2 minutes before departure. Henshaw removed his coat, hat, and gloves, all of which were identical to those worn by his companion beneath a travel cloak. He turned to me. What you witnessed, Watson, was not a disappearance, but a substitution. One man stepped off the stage, the other stepped into the role. And the second man, I asked, a relation, though not a public one, half-brother, same jawline, same build, a resemblance deepened by artifice and purpose. Holmes's tone darkened slightly. He had once worn a uniform, though he no longer had the right. His name no longer appears on the muster rolls, but he was useful for this. Holmes pointed toward the signal gate at the far end of the platform. That unscheduled pause, reported by the station master, that was not chance. It was a signal, arranged in advance. The details now fit together with cruel precision. The 30-second halt, the lack of surveillance, the patch of fence behind the hedgerow, all became, in Holmes's words, a door without hinges. Henshaw stepped out during the delay, he said. Through the carriage door, he vanished into the mist before the train had resumed its full crawl. And the porter was watching the wrong man, the one meant to be seen. It was an illusion born not of cunning, but of sacrifice. We took a bench beneath the station's central clock, and there Holmes spoke with a gravity I had rarely seen in him. The man now calling himself Percy Henshaw is not the man who entered the Foreign Office 10 years ago. He is a brother in blood, but not in service. The original, R. Henshaw, orchestrated his own removal. The other remained behind to carry the scrutiny, to play the part until it could be no longer sustained. Holmes produced a thin dossier, one I had not seen before, and passed it to me. His half-brother was court-martialed in 1887, he said. The records were buried, a charge of conduct unbecoming, of correspondence with the enemy. Disappeared before sentence was pronounced. And now? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Now he wears another man's coat and carries another man's shame. The realization struck me not with shock, but with a kind of tragic inevitability. Henshaw knew he could not be trusted, I said, or rather, that he would no longer be trusted. So he made a choice to disappear in disgrace and let his name be tarnished so that no questions would rise to the surface. Exactly, Holmes said. He made his own guilt a shield for the nation's secrets. I could not help but speak. But at what cost? He will never return. His service will not be honoured. He is now, in every official record, a man disgraced. Holmes met my eyes. And yet he may have prevented a diplomatic rupture whose consequences we shall never be asked to measure. We departed the platform in silence, Holmes walking with that thoughtful slowness that always followed the unravelling of a human knot more complex than any cipher. At last he spoke. "It was not a disappearance, Watson. It was a trade." I nodded. A man gave up his identity to protect a truth. Another man gave up his name to repay a debt. "And what do we do?" I asked. Holmes paused only a moment. "We let them vanish, with dignity, if not reward." As we passed the gas lamp that stood at the entrance to Platform 9, I looked back once, not for a clue, but for the man who had once waited there. He was no longer visible, and perhaps he had never intended to be. The house at number 17 Brixham Terrace seemed quieter than memory permitted. Though it had never possessed the sociable warmth of a proper residence, on our return some days later, the stillness was absolute. It was not merely empty, it had been vacated, in the truest and most deliberate sense of the word. Holmes did not knock, but entered with a nod from the reluctant landlady. The room at the top of the stairs, where the impostor had once resided, was stripped of every personal trace. The curtains were gone, the fire grate swept clean, and a faint echo answered back as our steps crossed the bare floorboards. No forwarding address had been left. The register bore a name already forgotten by the ink. The very air, once scented faintly with burnt tobacco and cheap hair tonic, now smelled only of cold plaster. "He was never meant to stay," Holmes murmured, "only to pause long enough to become someone else." The landlady, a thin and wary woman of an indeterminate age, appeared both relieved and discomfited by our return. Her recollection of the lodger's final night was scant, though not without curious detail. "He paid in full," she said. "No complaints, no notice, just left the coin on the hall table and took the back stairs." Holmes inquired about possessions. She shook her head. "Left nothing, sir, except a cigarette case on the windowsill. I didn't touch it. Didn't seem right." We followed her gaze to the pale light above the stairwell. The object in question, silver, scuffed and modest, still rested there, half concealed by the drawn blind. Holmes retrieved it with a gloved hand and studied the engraving. 3 letters had been scratched with care and wear, L-E-M. "Neither Henshaw," he mused aloud, "nor Henry Duval, nor any of the other names we have encountered." He turned the case in his palm once more, a name he was never meant to say aloud. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes sat in his usual position, legs crossed, fingers steepled, back to the fire, while I pored over telegram slips and railway guides that now littered the centre table. It was from among these fragments that Holmes selected a single cablegram, its edges thumb-worn, its ink slightly blurred. The message was brief, almost brutally so. "Departure confirmed. Calais via Dover. No return passage." The sender was anonymous, but Holmes's expression required no elaboration. The thread, thin as it was, pointed southward, away from the known world and toward a continent where new names could be purchased and old debts left unpaid. "From Calais," Holmes said quietly. "Marseille is a logical terminus. It possesses all the qualities a man in flight would require: anonymity, traffic, and proximity to wider seas." "Do you believe he still lives?" I asked. Holmes offered no reply, only the faintest narrowing of the eyes, as if already following the man's footprints down the stone quay of the Vieux-Port. The trail, once faint, did not vanish entirely. Among the papers forwarded by Holmes's correspondents abroad, one stood out, a French customs report, part of a routine quarterly archive, wherein a curious note had been scribbled in the margin: "Anglais, lunettes teintées, nom incertain, logé 2 nuits à la pension Aubépine, disparu sans solde." It described a gentleman, tall and reserved, who wore tinted spectacles and spoke with the careful French of an educated foreigner. His passport bore a name that aroused no suspicion, though the ink was newer than the paper. He arrived on a Thursday, departed on a Saturday. Except no carriage, no ferry, and no ship logged his exit. He simply vanished. His room was left in order, save for a chess pawn carved from bone, placed in the centre of the washstand. Holmes lingered over that detail. A man who disappears does not often leave behind metaphors, he said, unless he means to be read by only one reader. Weeks passed. The spring light softened the city's edges, and yet the case did not fade from Holmes's mind. Nor, if I'm honest, from mine. Then one afternoon, as I returned from a patient in Kensington, Mrs. Hudson presented me with a single postcard that had arrived in my absence. It bore no sender's name, no return address, only a single word, in a hand that was both unfamiliar and unmistakably deliberate. Merci. The card's image, printed in subdued hues, was of a railway bench on a lonely platform. Not a station I recognised, no signs, no clock, no people. Only a bench in the shadow of a lamppost and the faint outline of rails vanishing into mist. I showed it to Holmes without speaking. He took it in silence, his expression unreadable. He examined both sides, held it to the window light, and ran a finger along its edge. "A thank you without sender," I said. "Do you suppose it is from—" But I did not finish the question. I knew he would not answer. Holmes did not speak. He merely crossed the room to the hearth, where the fire had dwindled to a soft bed of embers. Without hesitation, he held the postcard above the coals. A moment passed. Then he released it. The card caught at once, the flame rising greedily along the edges. Holmes watched as it curled inward, the image of the lonely bench distorting, blackening, and at last vanishing altogether in a fat curl of grey. He remained still, as the final corner flaked to nothingness. "A man writes to thank us," I said, "and you burn his words." Holmes turned from the grate. "He did not write to be answered," he replied. "He wrote to be forgotten." I understood then. Some stories are not meant for justice or recognition or even remembrance. They are meant only to pass, like a figure in tinted glasses, stepping into the mist beyond the harbour. And so, silently, we let it pass. The morning passed without ambition. A grey light seeped through the thin curtains of our Baker Street sitting room, neither brightening the space nor retreating entirely. Outside, a fine mist clung to the rooftops and rendered every sound from the street below muted and formless. It was a day of no particular distinction, and yet one heavy with the quiet gravity of unspoken thought. Holmes had taken to his chair by the hearth, his long fingers stained faintly with tobacco ash, his gaze distant and unblinking. He had not spoken since breakfast, and his pipe had long since cooled to a spent curl of smoke at his feet. I sat opposite, reviewing my own scribbled notes from the affair which had preoccupied us these past weeks, though I found them strangely reluctant to yield a proper ending. There was no telegram, no arrest, no further summons to the yard, only a silence that had settled between us and stayed. It was I who at last broke the stillness, though my voice came with less confidence than I had intended. "Holmes," I said, did you let him escape?" His gaze did not shift, nor did he betray surprise at the question. I felt suddenly the weight of what I had asked, for it was not merely the physical departure of a man I questioned, but the deeper question of complicity. "We know his name was not his own," I continued, "nor his path clean. We know he vanished into the fog by his own design, and yet," I paused, "and yet you made no effort to stop him." The pipe at Holmes's elbow remained untouched. His fingers moved only to adjust the cuff of his dressing gown, an absent gesture I had come to associate with deep thought. "You knew, didn't you? That night on the platform, you knew what he was doing, and you let him go." Holmes did not look at me. He addressed instead the air between us, not with irritation, but with a peculiar detachment that often marked his more philosophical moods. "There are verdicts," he said, "which no judge will pronounce, and no gavel record, but they are passed all the same." He turned slowly to face the hearth. "You ask whether justice was served. I ask, by whom and in whose ledger?" He exhaled sharply through his nose. "To seize a man by the wrist and drag him to Bow Street may satisfy the page, Watson, but not always the principal." He reached for the poker and stirred the ash absently. "You speak of escape," he said, "but what prison could I have offered him more absolute than the one he entered willingly?" I said nothing, for what does one answer when silence has the greater truth? I leaned back in my chair and glanced down once more at the notes in my lap. Names, half struck through, others underlined and circled, initials whose ownership was no longer clear. There had been a photograph, I recalled, now tucked in the back of the dispatch folder, a face of quiet strength, but whose eyes, I now understood, belonged to no single man. There had been an unsigned letter, a ticket never used, a uniform never reclaimed, and a brother who had been both mirror and shadow, who had stepped forward into disgrace, so another could vanish with purpose. "I wonder," I said aloud, "if we ever truly knew who we were pursuing or protecting." Holmes replied softly, "Perhaps that is the point." He leaned his head back against the chair. "Names are tools, Watson. Sometimes they are shields, and sometimes, very rarely, they are gifts given at a cost." He rose now, Holmes, with that slow and almost reluctant energy I had seen in him after only the gravest of cases. He crossed to the window and stood there for a long moment, hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing nothing in particular through the London haze. "There are crimes," he said, "which must be committed in order to prevent greater ones." It was not a defence. It was not even an argument. "Cicero," he added without turning, "and Tacitus, I believe, had the last word. They make a desert and call it peace." His voice held no triumph, no remorse either, only the weariness of a man who had long known that truth does not always walk in daylight. He turned from the window. "We did not lose him, Watson. We let him go, because what he carried was already too heavy to be shared. I made some final notes that morning, though my pen faltered more than once. The facts, such as they were, had been laid bare, yet the story did not conclude. Not in the usual sense. There was no villain caught, no jury summoned, no confession rendered. There was only the image of a man walking alone into a silence of his own making, and of another walking in his place. The page before me remained curiously sparse. My fingers lingered over the inkpot, but the words would not come. Across the hearth, Holmes relit his pipe and returned to his chair without comment. The smoke curled upward, thin and steady, vanishing against the light. "There is nothing more to write," I said quietly. He looked at me then, and for the first time in hours, smiled. "Then don't." And so I did not. We sat in silence, Holmes and I, as the fire sank to embers, and the story, unfinished, disappeared into smoke. The fog lay low over London that morning, thick as wool and twice as grey. It curled about the eaves of Paddington Station like a living thing, seeping into collars and cuffs, softening the gas lamps to faint amber blurs. The great iron arches overhead wept with condensation, their slow drip swallowed in the hush that precedes a train's arrival. I had no purpose in being there, not truly. The case was long concluded, or perhaps more accurately, permitted to fade from the record in dignified silence. Holmes had not stirred from Baker Street. He had, in fact, shown no interest in revisiting the scene, but something drew me there nonetheless. It was not duty, nor was it curiosity. It was the echo of a moment which had lingered ever since, like the scent of coal smoke in the folds of a winter coat. So I stood once more upon platform 9, my breath rising pale before me, and waited. There it was, precisely as I had left it, The bench of plain oak, rubbed smooth by countless weary travellers, its iron arms worn with time. The morning frost had settled into its crevices, silvering the wood. No placard marked its history. No plaque bore the names of those who had sat, risen, and vanished. And yet I could not help but feel it remembered. Here, days or perhaps a lifetime ago, a briefcase had rested, unremarkable in appearance, yet heavy with consequence. Here Holmes had spoken little and observed much. Here, too, a man had passed, nameless in the crowd, his footsteps swallowed by steam. No physical trace remained, but the silence about the bench was different, denser, as though it bore witness still, not to the noise of trains or the cries of porters, but to a quiet compact made in shadows and kept by men who preferred the dark. It was then I noticed him, the man with no luggage and no companion, striding toward the westbound line with a purpose that was neither hurried nor hesitant. His coat was of good cloth, but unremarkable cut. His hat pulled low. There was nothing in his bearing that invited attention, and yet I watched. He reached the carriage without pause, ascended the step with practiced ease, and disappeared into its interior with not so much as a backward glance. No whistle had sounded. No porter cried out. The fog wrapped the train in soft concealment, and the man became part of it, absorbed into a tide that had carried others before him. I never saw his face. I never would. But I knew the type. Not a criminal, not a hero, only a man whose journey required silence more than recognition, and whose name was not meant for ledgers. The train groaned into motion, slow and unwilling at first, as though the very air clung to it. The wheels began their rhythm, soft as breath, and the mist closed behind them like a curtain gently drawn. I remained where I stood, one hand gloved and resting on the iron post beside me. It occurred to me then, not for the first time, that not all travels are meant to end in arrival. Some lives are written not in the reaching, but in the leaving, in the choices to vanish so others may remain. Justice, I had once believed, wore a robe and held a gavel, but I had come to understand it might also wear no face at all, only silence and a departing train. Holmes had known. He always did. He simply chose to say less than he saw, as only a man burdened with truth often does. I turned from the platform at last. The fog did not lift, nor did the silence break. A whistle blew somewhere beyond, thin and wistful, then was gone. As I descended the steps toward the street, I looked back only once, not at the train, long vanished, but at the bench. It had not moved, nor had it forgotten. Some passengers are not meant to arrive, only to disappear, and I left the rest to the mist. We sat once more in the quiet of Baker Street, the fog outside thickening like unspoken truths. Holmes, pipe in hand, stared into the hearth with an expression more introspective than triumphant. "Justice, Watson," he murmured at last, "is not always found in courtrooms nor pronounced in headlines. There are cases where the greatest service one can render to one's country is to vanish, not in shame, but in sacrifice. The world may never know his name, and perhaps it is better that way." He tapped the ash from his pipe. "History, after all, often forgets its guardians. What do you think was Henshaw's true motive? Loyalty to country, guilt for past alliances, or something far more personal? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your theory in the comments below, and if this mystery stirred your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and pass the story along to those who appreciate the quiet brilliance of Sherlock Holmes.